The Senate recesses for their weekly party lunch meetings between 12:30 and 2:15 Eastern. Then they'll return and resume debate on that payroll tax credit bill. The House gavels in today at noon Eastern. They begin debate on a bill that would repeal the health care law. Live coverage now from the U.S. Senate here on C-SPAN 2.
Dr. Barry Black will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal God, the world and all that is in it belong to you. You built our earth on the deep waters and laid its foundations in the ocean depths. Great and marvelous are your works. Give our senators this day your hand of mercy so that they will feel your peace and be guided by your wisdom. Remind them that their value comes not only in actions in the work arena, but also in reflection and meditation and prayer when they are not on Capitol Hill. Keep them close to you and constantly aware of your abiding spirit in their lives. As they make time for quiet deliberation and circumspection, may they grow in the assurance of your power. We pray in your sacred name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., July 10, 2012. To the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Richard Blumenthal, a senator from the state of Connecticut, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President Pro Tempore.
The Majority Leader.
I now move to proceed to count number 341, S2237.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 341, S2237, a bill to provide a temporary income tax credit for increased payroll and so forth and for other purposes.
Mr. President, the next hour will be equally divided between the Democrats and Republicans. The majority will control the first half, Republicans the final half. At 11:30 today, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the nomination of John Folks the United States District Judge for the Western District of Tennessee. At noon, there will be a roll call vote on confirmation of that nomination. The Senate will then recess from 12:30 until 2:15 p.m. to allow for our weekly caucus meetings. At approximately 2:25 then, there will be a cloture vote on the motion to proceed to S2237, which is the Small Business Jobs and Tax Relief Act. Yes, 3364 is to the desk, and it's due for a second reading, I'm told.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S3364, a bill to provide an incentive for businesses to bring jobs back to America.
Mr. President, I would object to any further proceedings with respect to this bill at this time.
The objection having been heard, the bill will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that interns in Senator Bingham's office be granted floor privileges during today's session. Marisa Holloway, Sarah Hurd, Leif Ramison, that's Rasmussen, Edna Reyes, Emily Schwab, Catherine Wills, Mia Brown.
Without objection.
I also ask, Mr. President, unanimous consent that staff of the Finance Committee be allowed today to have floor privileges. Jeffrey Arnold, Avital Barnea, Amanda Chapman, Selena Christensen, Selena Chrisman, Harun Dogo, Farah Fries, Pete Markison, Neil Piney, Christopher Tasovich, Daniel West, Micah Scudder, Daniel Herring.
Without objection.
Mr. President, my Republican colleagues really do talk a good game on taxes, but Democrats' record of cutting taxes for small businesses speaks louder than Republicans' rhetoric. Since President Obama took office, taxes have been cut for small businesses 18 times. And today he'll advance a plan to cut taxes for small firms for the 19th time in just 3.5 years. The Small Business Jobs and Tax Relief Act would put money back in the coffers of true job creators. Under our plan, business owners who hire new workers or give raises to current employees would get a 10% tax credit. Our legislation would also cut taxes of firms that invest in new equipment, allowing more than 2 million businesses to grow faster. These two proposals will create almost 1 million new jobs. And economists from across the political spectrum agree this is the most effective way to give the economy a badly needed boost. So if my Republican colleagues want their records to match their rhetoric, they'll end their filibuster of this worthy measure, and they'll vote to support the real job creators, businesses that grow and hire. Unfortunately, while Republicans agree we should cut taxes, their approach is completely different than ours. Congressional Republicans want to lavish huge across-the-board tax breaks on billionaire hedge fund managers and people like mega-rich celebrities like Donald Trump. Unlike our proposal, the Republican plan, which passed the House of Representatives, wouldn't do a thing to encourage hiring. More than 99% of business in America would qualify for this extravagant tax break, even if they don't create a single new job or raise wages for one solitary employee. In fact, fabulously rich so-called small business owners like Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton could qualify for these wasteful giveaways. Even though 3/4 of Americans oppose tax breaks for the wealthiest few, nearly half the benefits of this $46 billion proposal would go to millionaires and billionaires. Mr. President, we Democrats want to cut taxes for small businesses, but the Republicans' alternative that's passed the House of Representatives is simply the wrong way to do it.
Mr. President,
The Republican leader.
last Friday morning, the American people woke up to the news that the economy is on life support. And the first response of the President of the United States was that we're headed in the right direction. The President says we're headed in the right direction. Now, just think about that for a second. The President's first reaction to the news that more Americans signed up for disability last month than got jobs was to flash a thumbs up and head back to the campaign trail. Just like his first reaction to a question about the economy at a recent White House press conference was to say that the private sector is doing just fine. Well, obviously, answers like that just aren't going to cut it. The President's advisors must be telling him that much. So yesterday, the President, the man at the wheel, changed his tune by doing his Washington best to change the subject. For 3.5 years, this White House has shown an utter lack of imagination when it comes to jobs and the economy. If the solution doesn't involve more government, they're not interested. That's all they've got. So yesterday, the President went back to the same well one more time. After 3.5 years of more government, more debt, more spending, more taxes, more regulations, he demanded even more. Yesterday, the President issued an ultimatum. Raise taxes on about 1 million business owners to fund more government, and I won't raise taxes on the rest of you. Raise taxes on about 1 million business owners, and I won't raise taxes on the rest of you. That was his considered response to this crisis. Now let's leave aside for a second the complete and total absurdity of raising taxes on job creators in the middle of what some are calling the slowest recovery ever. Leave that aside and ask yourself a more fundamental question. Whose money is it in the first place? Whose money is it in the first place? I mean, why should small businesses be put on the defensive about keeping money they've worked for and earned? It seems like every day for the past 3.5 years we've woken up to stories about waste and abuse in government. Whether it's a bankrupt solar company or the $800,000 party some government agency threw for itself, or this week's report that we overspent on unemployment benefits by about $14 billion. As far as I'm concerned, there shouldn't even be a debate here. The government doesn't need any more money. It's government that should be answering to us for the tax dollars it's wasted and misdirected. It's the president who should be on the defensive. He's the one who pledged he'd cut the deficit in half by the end of his first term, but doubled it instead. He's the one who spent the first 3.5 years of his administration shattering spending records. And now he wants us to believe that he'll direct new tax revenue toward tackling the deficit. Look, yesterday's announcement was many things, but let's be honest, it wasn't a plan for deficit reduction. And it sure wasn't a plan for job creation. First and foremost, it was a distraction. By any standard, the president has a nightmarish economic record. A nightmarish economic record. By demanding higher taxes on the few, he's trying to direct attention from it. Second, it's deeply ideological. The president has already admitted that the last thing you do in the middle of a recession is raise taxes. He knows yesterday's proposal would only make the economy worse. He knows that. His goal isn't jobs, it's income redistribution. It's his idea of fairness, which means you earn, he takes. His definition of fairness means you earn and he takes. And third, it's purely political. The president's top priority for the last year hasn't been creating jobs, it's been saving his own. Let me say that again. The top priority of the president the last year hasn't been creating jobs for anybody else, it's saving his own job. And his advisors seem to think if they create enough scapegoats, he'll slip by in November. That's why he spent the past year trying to convince the public that somehow his predecessor is more responsible for the economic failures of the past 3.5 years than he is. That all the bailouts and the trillions in borrowed money and the government takeover of health care and the onslaught of bureaucratic red tape and regulations are somehow irrelevant to the fact that we're mired in the slowest economic recovery in modern times. That we're just one more stimulus away from an economic boom. That the fact that we've had unemployment above 8% for 41 straight months has nothing to do with the policies he put in place in his first 2 years in office. That all these massive pieces of legislation he touted were somehow hugely historic, and yet at the same time completely unrelated to the joblessness, uncertainty, and decline we've seen almost every day since. It's this kind of economic thinking that leads to the kind of proposal the president announced yesterday, which says that a tax hike is harmful to middle-income earners but somehow meaningless for the 940,000 business owners who will get slammed by this tax hike, as well as all the other tax hikes the president has in store for them at the end of this year. The sad truth is, the president isn't just ignoring the economic problems we face, he's exacerbating them. And he's running us headlong into the cliff that's fast approaching in January. Now, frankly, it's hard to imagine a president deliberately doing all these things he knows will only make things worse. But that's where we are. And now it's incumbent on the rest of us to outline a better path. And that's what we support. Common sense, pro-growth policies that liberate the private sector. It starts by repealing a health care law that's stifling businesses, by ending the senseless regulations that are crushing businesses, by ending the threats of tax hikes on businesses that can't afford them, and by putting our faith in free enterprise over the dictates of a centralized government. In the Obama economy, we need policies that are designed to create jobs, not destroy them. No one should see an income tax hike next year. No one. Not families, not small businesses, no one. We should extend all income tax rates while we make progress on fundamental tax reform. It's time to put the failed policies of the past 3.5 years aside and try something else. Washington has done enough damage to the economy already. Let's focus on the kind of pro-growth jobs proposals that the Republican-led House has already passed. And above all, let's do no harm. It's time to give the private sector and the innovators and the workers who drive it a fighting chance. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the following hour will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the majority controlling the first half and the Republicans controlling the final half.
Mr. President.
The senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, it's been 3 years. 3 years since my colleague from Kentucky who just spoke announced to America that his highest priority as a Senate leader was to make sure that Barack Obama was a one-term president. His highest priority. And since that time, we have seen a record number of Republican filibusters on the floor of the Senate, broken all records in terms of efforts to stop, even to allow a vote on the priorities of the Obama administration. And then for the Republican leader to come to the floor and bemoan the fact that the president has not done more suggests that he believes we're victims of political amnesia, and we're not. We know when the president came with a stimulus bill, when we were losing 800,000 jobs a month, that's what we were losing the month the president was sworn in. He came with a stimulus bill to turn the economy around, to give tax breaks to businesses and individuals. We ended up getting 3 Republicans who would join us over the objection of their leadership. We needed those 3 to break the Republican filibuster on the president's effort to get the economy moving forward again. And when it came time for health care reform, Senator Baucus, the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, invited the Republicans in, sit down and construct a bipartisan bill with us, and they walked away. They walked away and then started a Republican filibuster against any change in health care reform. Do you remember the Republican alternative for health care reform? Of course you don't, because there wasn't any. They didn't have a bill. They didn't even have a good idea. They were just here to say no and to use their filibuster to achieve it. The story is repeated over and over again. Trying to rein in Wall Street greed so we don't go through another recession like the one we're living through now. Not a single Republican would step up and support that. Not one. And we faced a Republican filibuster again. So for the Republican leader to come to the floor and bemoan the fact that certain things have not occurred here is to ignore the reality that he said his highest priority was to make Barack Obama a one-term president, and he has shown it with an endless stream of Republican filibusters. Now let's get down to tax cuts. What President Obama said yesterday was this: to every single American, your first $250,000 in income, your first $250,000 will continue to receive a good tax break. There will be no increase in taxes on your first $250,000 in income. Now, for 98% of Americans, that's great. because they make less than $250,000. So they're not going to see any tax increase by the president's proposal. But for the 2% who make more than $250,000, the president's suggestion was, let's go back to the tax rates for that money earned over $250,000. Go back to the tax rates of the Clinton years, which was a time of dramatic economic expansion and the last time we in Washington balanced a budget. That's not a radical idea. It's a sensible idea. And you can't come to the floor of the Senate day after day and week after week posing for holy pictures about dealing with the deficit, my goodness, the debt, the deficit, and then when you suggest raising taxes this much on 2% of the American people to say, oh, that's just unacceptable. The only way to reach fiscal stability and deal with the deficit is to put it all on the table, to make sure that spending as well as revenue are on the table. And if we can't touch income over $250,000 for the top 2% of Americans, we will never honestly deal with the deficit crisis. The Republican leader came to the floor and said, well, last week's employment numbers were not that encouraging. And I would join him in saying, I wish they were better too. I'm not going to tell you this is where I want to be, but I will say this. For 28 straight months under President Obama, we have seen increases in private sector employment. Jobs are being lost in the public sector, you know that. Being lost back home as state and local governments and others are reducing their payrolls. That's part of it. It's one of the reasons why we haven't seen a more fulsome growth in employment. That's a reality. But private sector job growth has continued for 28 straight months. And for the Republican leader to suggest the president took this news and then went out on the campaign trail, he forgot something. Last Friday, President Barack Obama signed the bipartisan transportation bill, a bill which will create and keep 2 million Americans working in this country, building the infrastructure that we need. A bill we've been waiting for 3 years, and the president signed it. I'm glad he did. Helps Illinois, and it helps the nation. Let me also say that we can do more things to help get this economy moving forward. The first thing I'd like to see is the Republicans to end their filibuster against the small business bill we'll have before us today. What does this bill do? This bill says to small businesses across America, we will give you a tax credit if you will create jobs or if you will expand your payroll. A tax credit. And we will give you a quicker depreciation on those items of equipment, technology, and capital that you purchase now. This would be a shot in the arm. It's a recipe every Republican has sworn to Grover Norquist they're going to stand by hell or high water to cut taxes on small businesses so they create jobs. Give them a break to buy equipment so that they can depreciate it more quickly and create the jobs of those who are supplying them. What's wrong with this notion? It's supposed to be the Republican credo, cut taxes, and for small business. Can't we agree on that? No. We're facing a Republican filibuster on that, too. Well, it's an illustration in my mind of an example of a bill that could move us forward with 1 million new jobs. Why won't the Republicans join us on this? Well, because they've said over and over again, they want this president to be a one-term president. They don't want success. They don't want job creation on his watch. They want as miserable a record as they can help produce to take into the November election. In fact, one Republican senator said 2 weeks ago in the press, I hope the defense contractors start laying people off with the prospects of spending cuts in the future. And the sooner the better. Don't wait until after the election, he said. Do it now. How can you say that when you face these workers and their families? We don't want anyone laid off. We want people to have an opportunity to work good-paying jobs. I think we understand what we face today. We have to come together as a nation with solutions that aren't part of the presidential campaign rhetoric. I served on the Simpson-Bowles Commission. I think it was a responsible way, I didn't agree with all of it, but a responsible way to move forward on deficit reduction. But we also put everything on the table in terms of deficit reduction. And we conceded the fact that we can't start the cutting that's needed until we bring ourselves strongly out of this recession. We are moving forward on that path. It is time for us to continue that movement forward on a bipartisan basis. I'm asking for somebody to throw open the windows and bring in some fresh air in the Senate this afternoon. When we vote on the small business tax credits to create more jobs across America, I'm asking the Republicans to join us. You know, this is not about President Obama. This is about America, its workers, its families, and our economy. If there was ever a time we should come together on a bipartisan basis, knock down the Republican filibuster, bring this bill to the floor, let's do our very best to create new jobs and move this country forward. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
The senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I rise once again to discuss the production tax credit for wind energy, and I want to urge all of my colleagues to extend it as soon as possible. I've been coming to the Senate floor on an ongoing basis to highlight the tremendous growth of the wind energy industry from Colorado to Texas to Pennsylvania. And today I want to talk about the future of clean energy jobs in the great state of Rhode Island. If you look around our country, Mr. President, we find success stories everywhere. And wind energy is a bright spot for communities across America, which supports good manufacturing jobs in places like the United States and Rhode Island, and this is despite the Great Recession. Rhode Island has dedicated itself to building a clean energy future, a key part of which is offshore wind energy. The entire eastern seaboard has massive offshore wind potential, and Rhode Island is one of the first states to begin construction on a project off of its coast. And if you look at the chart here, Mr. President, you see the potential for job creation. And you also see that Rhode Island is on track to meet 75% of its energy needs through offshore wind development. Rhode Island has been the beneficiary of a number of companies locating themselves there, but one in particular I want to call attention to, and that's TPI Composites. It has been manufacturing wind turbine blades at their facilities in Warren, Rhode Island for years. And this decision to move to Warren was a good one for TPI because Rhode Island is known for its manufacturing acumen. And the good paying jobs have been a result of TPI's locating itself in Warren, Rhode Island. In fact, I would also mention that President Obama just paid a visit to a TPI facility in Iowa last month. TPI has also opened a facility, Mr. President, just across the Rhode Island state line in Fall River, Massachusetts, that will also focus on the development and the manufacturing of wind blades for offshore wind turbines. But I want to return to the reason I'm coming to the floor of the Senate on a daily basis. With the looming expiration of the production tax credit, orders for new wind blades have dropped, and TPI has been forced to cut its Rhode Island workforce by 15%. And in fact, its new facility in Fall River sits empty and idle as new wind blade development has been put on hold. So, Mr. President, that's why I keep coming to the floor, because we need to pass an extension of the wind production tax credit. It equals jobs. We need to pass it as soon as possible. Mr. President, this is a travesty that we have not extended the wind production tax credit, particularly in a time when we still need to create more jobs. And I know that the two senators from Rhode Island agree with me. Communities like Warren, Rhode Island have benefited from the growth in the wind energy industry, but they're still hurting because of the Great Recession, and our failure to act is making things worse. We face a stark choice, Mr. President. We can let the PTC expire and continue to lose good-paying Rhode Island jobs, or we can invest in America's future and take advantage of a manufacturing sector that's poised to expand. The development of offshore wind is coming to the eastern seaboard, and the opportunities for American manufacturers like TPI to grow their business and beat our international competitors are right there within our grasp. There's simply so much more economic growth possible if we would just simply extend the PTC. But our inaction is stunting the growth of this important industry today. And that's why I urge my colleagues to join us in extending the wind PTC as soon as possible. Mr. President, I'm really pleased that my colleagues from Rhode Island, who of course know their home state better than I could ever hope to, have joined me, Senator Reid and Senator Whitehouse. They know the difficult economic challenges that their state has faced, and they know how important the production tax credit is to jobs in their state. They've spent their public service careers fighting for the middle class, fighting for policies that create good-paying American-based jobs, and I'm very much interested in hearing what they have to say on this important subject. So, Mr. President, as my colleagues have come to expect, I'll be back on the floor tomorrow talking about the wind PTC every day until we pass the extension of it. Thank you, Mr. President. I look forward to hearing from my colleagues from the state of Rhode Island.
President. Senator from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to commend Senator Udall for his leadership on this very important issue. I also want to commend my colleague, Senator Whitehouse, who has been extraordinarily effective as a national leader on energy policy and ocean policies. And we are, as Senator Udall pointed out, at a very critical moment. Nationally, with the support of the Wind Production Tax Credit, or the PTC, nearly 500 facilities across 44 states manufacture components for wind energy industry. These products are critical to our future. And the U.S. content of wind turbines installed in the United States has grown from 25% prior to 2005 to 60% today, according to the American Wind Energy Association. So we're actually seeing a situation in which American components are displacing foreign components in wind turbine facilities that are being deployed here in the United States. And that is an encouraging sign, because it means more jobs in manufacturing. It means more American content in products that will be purchased by Americans. And this is fundamentally premised on the availability of the PTC, and so we have to maintain it. If we do not, then we're, again, at the mercy of world markets in which we know, or we suspect let me say, that there are countries who are supporting directly and indirectly their wind energy sectors very aggressively. We need comprehensive reform of our tax code. That will be discussed, I'm sure, in the months ahead. But we can't forget that this production tax credit for wind credits and other clean energy resources supports many manufacturing jobs across the country. It saves money for middle-class families, and it increases our global competitiveness. And so as we think about tax reform, we also have to think about those programs that produce jobs. And this program is one of those job-producing tax provisions. We in Rhode Island have taken steps, as Senator Udall has alluded to try to position ourselves to be in the forefront of wind production, particularly offshore wind production, due in part to strong state policy, and I'll commend my colleagues at the state government. We rank 5th in the country, according to the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, in terms of their annual energy efficiency scorecard. Our utility, National Grid, our state leaders are taking very aggressive steps to lower the amount of energy that we use, which helps us in terms of our competitiveness across the globe and with other states in the country. We've also, as I said, tried to be a leader in offshore wind for obvious reasons. Senator Udall had a map of Rhode Island. We are the ocean state. We are linked to the ocean inextricably and historically. And so offshore wind is something that could be a huge benefit not only to ourselves but to our region. Quonset Point, the former naval base, which was closed in the 1970s, but fortunately, through the work of our predecessors, became the site of submarine construction, and I think the Senator from Connecticut is aware of that at Quonset Point. But now it can be the site of the fabrication of turbines because of our access to the coast, because of the investments we made in terms of cranes, because of the investment we've made in shoring up the docks and the bulkheads. So we are positioned, we hope, to go ahead and be a leader in the nation and in the world in the assembly fabrication of ocean wind turbines. Now, part of this is not just the manufacturing expertise. Part of it is also the fact that we have done the fundamental environmental work necessary to make sure that this economic development is environmentally sound as well as economically sound. Our local leaders have created an Ocean Special Area Management Plan, or Ocean SAMP, which essentially is the zoning for the proper placement of wind turbines in the ocean. It takes into consideration the geology, it takes into consideration tides, it takes into consideration fishing patterns, it takes into consideration recreational use of the waters. And they've come up with a very sophisticated plan, so we are well positioned to start creating this offshore wind production facility with the jobs onshore. And also, as my colleague from colleague from Colorado has pointed out, we have companies in the state that are leaders worldwide. TPI is one of them. It started as a boat builder. It used fiberglass to fabricate hulls for boats. It was sophisticated. It was state-of-the-art. But then they shifted several years ago because they saw the direction of this wind power development worldwide, and they started producing fiberglass blades for wind power. They have a wonderful facility in Warren, Rhode Island, and we're on the verge of expanding. But again, as my colleague has pointed out, because of the uncertainty of the tax credit, because of many other factors, they've been able, unfortunately, they've had to reduce some of their workforce. We want to see them start growing again. We want TPI to be, as it is, a world leader in the production of this type of technology. It's sophisticated. These are good jobs. They're manufacturing jobs. They're American jobs. They're the kind of work that we want to be doing worldwide, so that when you go any place in the world and you look up, you'll see a blade that was made in Warren, Rhode Island, not in someplace else, China or elsewhere. We have a challenge in Rhode Island, 11% unemployment. So these jobs are the kind of jobs not only do we want for the moment, but we want for the future, because they're valuable, because they are not just a contribution in the short run to putting people to work, but they're a contribution in the long run to our economy, to better use of energy, to better environmental quality, to a host of values that will turn out to have huge tangible benefits for the people around and the people of this nation. So again, let me commend the senator from Colorado for his consistent, persistent efforts to ensure that we do not forget the production tax credit, that we are there working hard to ensure that we're able to support American manufacturing. With that, I will yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I'm delighted to join my senior Senator Jack Reed on the Mark Udall National Economic Tour of the Renewable Energy Production Tax Credit, and I'm delighted that that daily tour has touched on Rhode Island today. This Renewable Energy Production Tax Credit is a vital part of our energy security strategy. It is pretty simple. It provides a per kilowatt-hour corporate tax credit for energy that is produced by various clean energy systems like wind or biomass or hydro or geothermal. Makes a lot of sense. We need to do it. The problem is that it expires at the end of this year. And given the way that wind, biomass, solar, and other such projects have to be financed in advance and built over time, the market effect of the expiration of this production tax credit at the end of this year is already being felt in projects that are not going forward now or are under a cloud right now because of the uncertainty that we are creating. We know what happens when we allow the production tax credit to fail. The installations of this kind of equipment drop dramatically. The Department of Energy estimates that new wind installations will be virtually non-existent next year if the production tax credit is allowed to expire. I don't know if there's a state in the Union in which people are not seeking to build wind energy to capture this free and abundant resource. All those projects will become non-existent if this does not continue. It really doesn't make any sense at all. In Rhode Island, it's particularly important not only because we don't have a lot of domestic energy sources, so this is a really good one for us as a domestic energy source, but also because of the jobs that these projects support. You're not supporting international shipping tycoons who bring the oil over here. We're not supporting Saudi princes who pump the stuff or other folks from OPEC around the world. We're supporting engineers in America, manufacturers in America, assemblers in America, factory workers in America when we go this route. And my home state is still at 11% unemployment. So we've got really no tolerance for knocking down these jobs. This is not an acceptable energy strategy. It's not an acceptable jobs strategy. It is really self-defeating from America's interests. Senator Reid mentioned TPI Composites. It is a great company. It is in Warren, Rhode Island. In the Warren and Bristol area, Mr. President, there is a real constellation of incredibly talented folks, small companies, who are affiliated with the boat building industry. TPI and others do composite work, hulls, spars, masts, stuff that is light, stuff that is strong, stuff that is fast, stuff that helps Rhode Island-built boats be the fastest and the best in the world. And this technology has been transitioned from just plain boat building, hull building, to building the giant wind vanes that turn on these giant wind turbines. So this is an important industry for us, and it's a valuable American industry. And the idea that we burn foreign oil rather than building composite wind vanes in Warren, Rhode Island, makes no sense at all. We're in the process right now of building some offshore wind in Rhode Island. We're in the final stages of getting the Department of Interior's approval. Senator Reid and I worked very hard to get Tiger Grant funding to our port, Quonset Point, where they've hardened up a pier so that a gigantic crane can operate on it. You don't see much in the pier now. It's just flat. But a huge number of very deep piers were drilled down. It was dug out. Steel was put in. Concrete was put down. Had we driven the pier out, the crane out on the old pier, it would have crumbled down into the water and taken the crane with it. So we had to harden up the pier to build this put this gigantic crane out there. And the crane is now in a position to take these big wind turbines, which are too big to put on a truck, they're too big to put on a train. You've got to build them, assemble them shoreside, and then barge them out to their location. We can do that now at Quonset Point. The project is expected to create 600 to 800 new jobs, and it really could expand beyond that and position this Rhode Island facility as a hub for regional wind energy manufacturing. So this is important to us. We need this production tax credit. And it goes along with a long history of government support for emerging industries. When the commercial airline industry was beginning to open up, it had immense government support from subsidized airmail, from military contracts, from aeronautics R&D. And the reason that we took it from the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk to massive Boeing factories, we're still one of the world leaders in aircraft production, is because along the way the government supported American industry because they knew, we knew, that this was an industry that had to compete with overseas manufacturers and needed our support. In the same way, the clean energy industry is an arena of international competition in which our country, our companies, we're competing with foreign interests. We're competing with foreign companies, and we're competing with the foreign governments that back them. Unfortunately, for many people in this building, they don't see that. All they see is the old fossil fuel industry, the dirty, polluting fossil fuel industry, and competition for the fossil fuel industry from clean energy. So they want to knock it down. Never mind that the well-established fossil fuel industries get far more in terms of government support than emerging clean energy technologies. The Environmental Law Institute points out that the U.S. has invested almost 6 times more in subsidies for fossil fuel from 2002 to 2008 than we did in renewable energy. So it's not like their hands are clean of government support. They're here sucking up all the government subsidies that they can. They just don't want clean energy to compete with them. They want to knock it down. That is a terrible mistake. We cannot allow the heavy hand of the fossil fuel industry lobbyists to stamp out competition in clean energy. It may be good for big oil, but it is not good for America because we are in international competition to lead the world and be the manufacturer of wind, of solar, of geothermal, and other technologies. we're going to end up buying this stuff. We want to also have built it. And if we can, we want to be exporting it as well. So we need to support these industries as they continue to develop and continue to grow so that we can once again lead the world as we have in the past. I want to thank again Senator Udall of Colorado for his leadership on this. He persistently and patiently comes every day to help make this point, and I'm delighted that he happened to choose Rhode Island as his point of focus today, because Rhode Island really does wrap it up. It really is energy security, energy independence, local jobs, and getting ahead and winning the game of international competition for this new technology. I thank the chair, and before yielding the floor, we'll ask that 4 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate be approved. They have the approval of the majority and the minority leaders. So may I ask unanimous consent that the request be agreed to and the request be printed in the record?
Without objection.
I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Iowa.
I didn't come to the floor to speak about the wind energy tax credit, but I want to say to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that I agree with them, and they probably know I agree with them because I'm the author of the wind energy tax credit of 1992, and I often tell people that when we worked so hard on that, I didn't have the slightest idea that it would turn out to be such a big thing that Iowa would be second in wind energy production in the nation. I think Texas is #1. And for sure, I didn't know that we would have manufacturing in our state as a result of it. And we've had companies come from Spain, from Germany, and then we've had from Colorado or Arizona component manufacturers that have come to Iowa. And there's about 4,000 people, maybe 5,000 people employed in my state in that. So I hope that we can get it reauthorized.
Would the senator yield for a question on that? I not only salute what you have done on the production tax credit, but I also recognize that one of our great Rhode Island companies that is developing bioprocessed algal fuels has opened its major facility in your state, and there's a very good Rhode Island-Iowa connection on the development of algal fuels, and I appreciate the fact that our 2 states are able to work together so that this Rhode Island company can have such a significant facility in Iowa.
Yeah, I believe for the senator from Rhode Island that I believe that Rhode Island facility went to an existing ethanol plant in Shenandoah, Iowa, in southwest Iowa. Well, folks, I have come to the floor to speak about the issue of taxes that is now a big issue, and not about the issue that the majority will set before the Senate to talk about today and tomorrow and however long it takes, but the issue that we heard from President Obama yesterday, talk about the need to raise taxes on those earning more than $250,000. We heard this from him again just yesterday, as we did last year quite a bit and the year before quite a bit, when he spoke in support of increasing taxes on the so-called wealthy. In his speech yesterday, he made the following points: that those making under $250,000 deserve certainty, and they deserve it now. Another point is that it's okay to increase taxes on small business owners making more than $250,000 because those tax increases would affect less than 3% of the small business owners. Another point, that those making more than $250,000 aren't paying their fair share. And another point, that we can't afford to extend the 2001 and 2003 bipartisan tax relief to these households because of the impact on the deficit. And lastly, that if Congress sent him a bill to extend the 2001 bipartisan tax relief just for those making under $250,000, he would sign the bill into law right away. Well, I come to the floor today to highlight what the President is not telling the taxpayers. First, on the issue of certainty, the President fails to mention what his plans are for the dozens of tax provisions that expired at the end of last year and the dozens more that are expiring at the end of this year. These provisions affect everyone from teachers who dip into their own pockets to purchase school supplies to families and students struggling to pay for higher tuition. They also include key incentives for businesses to invest in new equipment and engage in research needed to produce the products of tomorrow. The President also failed to mention what he would do about the alternative minimum tax that threatens an ever-increasing number of middle-class Americans each year, the same middle class that the President is telling the world that he wants to protect. And nothing wrong with protecting the middle class. Over the past several years, legislation was enacted in regard to the alternative minimum tax to avoid and avert this crisis happening to the middle class, and we did it through a series of patches to increase the exemption amount so these 30 million middle-class taxpayers aren't hurt with the alternative minimum tax. Now, the President also fails to mention whether he continues to support the middle-class tax increases that he included in his budget proposal. This is how the President proposes to tax the middle class. Would he reinstate the personal exemption phase-out and the PEAS limitation on itemized deductions? Additionally, would he impose a new 28% limitation on itemized deductions? Each of these provisions come with their own income thresholds and phase-out rules that increase complexity and increase taxpayer burden. Finally, the President fails to mention the tax increases he supported to pay for the health care reform legislation. These provisions include a bigger haircut on the deductions for medical expenses, lower contribution amounts for flexible savings accounts, and taxes on artificial knees and hips that medical device manufacturers have to pass on to the patients. Given all of the looming tax increases that the President failed to mention in his speech yesterday, it's difficult to see how extending just the 2001 and 2003 bipartisan tax relief provides certainty to taxpayers, including small business. The President agrees that they are job creators and engines of our economy. So the President recognizes a fact of life, that middle-class small business people are job creators. Unfortunately, he defends his tax increase this way on small businesses by claiming that the impact will be minimal because only 2 to 3% of the small businesses would be subject to this tax increase. Now, what the President fails to mention is that this 2 or 3% account for a large amount of activity and a large amount of the jobs created. We often talk, people on both sides of the aisle, about small business providing 70% of the new jobs being created in America. Now I want to go to see how the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is a nonpartisan congressional organization, and I want to emphasize the nonpartisan aspect of this because we often refer to them as authorities in this area. According to this Joint Committee, 53% of the flow-through business income would be subject to the President's proposed tax increases. So, as I said, 70% of the new jobs created here, but this 2 to 3% also accounts for about 25% of all employment in America. The President claims that he wants to give the 97% of small businesses a sense of permanence. Yet, the tax relief for those in this group is only for another year. Now, how do you get permanence if you only want to provide tax policy for 1 year? It just doesn't add up. The President continues to claim that we cannot afford to extend tax relief for those earning above $250,000 because of our current deficit situation. But he fails to mention any ideas for reducing the deficit by controlling spending or by enacting tax reform, which is the only real way to provide a sense of permanence and eliminate the uncertainty that we all agree keeps small and even larger corporations from hiring. At the start of his administration, the President established the Simpson-Bowles Commission to come up with a framework to address our current out-of-control spending, as well as to reform the tax code. The Commission issued a report over a year ago that included substantive proposals on how to reform the tax code. There are some things in the Simpson-Bowles plan that I like and some things that I don't like. I like that it would streamline the tax code, reduce tax rates across the board, broaden the tax base, enhance economic opportunity in the process. At the same time, it violates one of my core tenets of tax reform, that it not increase taxes overall, but it at least is, the Simpson-Bowles is at least a serious proposal. I think most everybody recognizes that. However, the President failed to embrace Simpson-Bowles plan and offered a token framework for corporate tax reform. Now, while the President agrees that our current corporate tax rate is too high, his framework is overly vague and provides little in the way of simplification. Instead, as one commentator put it, his proposal on corporate tax reform simply, quote, rearranges the deck chairs on the Titanic, end of quote. That being said, at least the President took a position on lowering the corporate tax rate to 28%. This is in stark contrast to his ideas on individual tax reform that he put on the table yesterday. Even thinner on details, his overarching principle for individual tax reform seems to be the wealthy should pay their fair share. Yet, after years of talking about the wealthy paying their fair share, he never defines what rate or amount of tax constitutes fair share for individual taxpayers. Adopting this rhetoric seems to indicate support using the tax codes to reduce income disparity between the highest and lowest taxpayers. However, data from the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, and again I emphasize nonpartisan, shows the so-called wealthy already pay the bulk of the taxes and that our tax code is highly progressive. I put a chart up here, and this chart will show you that if all federal taxes are considered, the top 5% of households pay an average effective rate of about 28% and account for nearly 45% of all federal receipts. In contrast, the bottom 20%, as you can see, pay an average effective tax rate of about 4% and account for less than 1% of all federal receipts. All federal taxes include income tax, corporate tax, excise, and payroll tax. The disparity is even greater when we only consider individual income taxes. This is actually a better measure since the President proposes to increase just income taxes on the so-called wealthy. Now, if you look at the chart that's before you, you will see that the bottom 40% of households have an average effective tax rate below zero. In contrast, the top 5% have an average effective tax rate of nearly 18% and account for 61% of income tax receipts. Now, I've highlighted the top 5% of these charts because these are the households generally earning more than $250,000. In other words, these are the wealthy households, according to the President. Now, looking at these numbers, it's fair to ask the President, once again, to define what he means by fair share. How high is the President willing to raise taxes to meet this objective? In other words, if this 5% is paying 61% of all the income tax receipts, how much more do they have to pay to satisfy the President that they're paying their fair share? In other words, define fair share. I've always stated that taxpayers should pay what they owe, not 1 penny more, not 1 penny less. Anyone who looks at my record will see that I have fought long and hard to shut down loopholes and ensure taxpayers of all incomes pay what they legally owe. However, I hold a fundamental different view from the President on how the economy works and what the government's role should be and the rate of taxation in contributing to government's role and enhancing the economy. I believe that the money one earns is that individual's, not a pittance that a taxpayer can keep based upon the good graces of the government. I generally believe that individuals have the right to enjoy the fruit of their success. I believe that the best way to increase wealth and livelihood of all Americans is through pro-growth policies that increase the size of the economic pie, not by redistributing the pie based upon some unspecified definition of fairness. I believe that 18% of the gross domestic product of this country is good enough for the government to collect and spend, and that's been pretty much that way over a 50-year average of taxes. That benchmark of 18% is what the government has collected consistently regardless of the statutory tax rates, whether they've been high or low. Generally, it brings in about the same amount of money. In other words, just because you raise tax rates on so-called wealthy people does not necessarily mean that we get the influx of revenue that some believe that we will get. And so this is obviously something that the President has not considered. And so, as I've often done in recent years, come to the floor to tell you that we still end up with about the same amount of money regardless of what the effective tax rate is. Because higher income individuals generally have a greater ability to choose the form of income that they will receive. They also have a greater ability to decide when they will recognize this income, such as through the sale of stock, in a way to limit their taxable income in a given year. They also have accountants, attorneys, to help them legally shield income from the view of the IRS. As taxes go up, so does the incentive then to reduce one's income through legal and non-legal means. I have a chart here that shows annual revenues as a percent of gross national product in relationship to top marginal tax rates. And this is in a period of time since World War II. So getting back to what I previously said, over a long period of time, the revenue coming into the federal Treasury tends to be about the same amount. I think this averages out about 18.2% of GDP. But you can see during the Eisenhower years, the marginal tax rate was 90%. Then starting with Kennedy, it became 70%. And then starting with Reagan, it became 50%. And then starting with Reagan once again, it came down to 30%. And then when Bush, the father, didn't keep his promise that, read my lips, no new taxes, he gave in on that and went back to 40%. And now under the 2001-2003 tax bills, it's at 35%. And of course, this is what the president says needs to be raised back to this level here. But as this chart shows, you can have high marginal tax rates, low marginal tax rates, but the people of this country have decided that they're going to send just so much money to us bums in Congress to spend. And so they decide how much we're going to get, and you can raise marginal tax rates. You can do what first President Bush did now, but you're still going to get about the same amount of revenue. So I hope that the president takes that into consideration and also considers the negative aspect when marginal tax rates are reduced. What this means is that we're not going to be able to tax our way to surpluses. We're going to have to make substantial adjustments on the spending side to bring in line with revenues. In other words, the bottom line of what I'd like to tell the president is that the American people of this country have not come to the conclusion that they're undertaxed. They've come to the conclusion that Congress spends too much, and the problem isn't on the tax side, the problem is on the expenditure side. History also shows that tax increases just lead to spending increases. Often on the floor of the Senate, I quote a Professor Vedder of Ohio State University, studied tax increases and spending for more than 2 decades. And some of his research goes back to World War II. His most recent work on this subject was with Stephen Moore, published in the Wall Street Journal. And I quote, over the entire post-War II era, through 2009, each dollar of new tax revenue has been associated with $1.17 of new spending. So you raise $1 here and you spend $1.17 over here, it's pretty obvious that bringing in more revenue isn't going to reduce the deficit. Another study, this one by the National Bureau of Economic Research, states that when it comes to fiscal adjustments, quote, those based upon spending cuts and no tax increases are more likely to reduce deficits and debt over gross domestic product ratios than those based upon tax increases. In addition, adjustments on the spending side rather than on the tax side are less likely to create a recession, end of quote. So we know that increasing taxes, including on targeted groups, is not going to reduce the deficit. American workers and businesses deserve tax reform and tax certainty. There is bipartisan agreement that we need comprehensive tax reform. What we need to get that done is real leadership. To be sure, lack of leadership is not because of lack of interest. The Senate Finance Committee, which I serve on, has held more than a dozen tax reform hearings during this Congress. The Senate Budget Committee has also held tax reform hearings. What has been lacking is what's so important in this town, presidential leadership. The president's speech yesterday was just that, a speech. As I outlined, he spoke only about extending certain tax relief measures for those earning under $250,000. However, he failed to address other looming tax increases and failed to discuss how his other tax increase proposals provide the certainty that he claims he wants to provide. It's easy for the President to engage in election year antics and goad Congress to send him a bill. Unfortunately, that's not leadership, and such speeches do nothing to help individuals and small businesses. If the President really was concerned about preventing tax increases on middle class and small businesses, he would at least be working with leaders in his own party to make sure that they all agreed on who the wealthy in this country really are and who ought to have their taxes increased. Because Democratic leaders in the House and Senate have signaled that they support extension of lower income tax rates for those making up to $1 million. In fact, a year ago this week, here in the Senate, we were debating the majority party's quote-unquote millionaire tax resolution. So if the President really wanted Congress to send him a bill that provided certainty to the taxpayers, he would make it a priority to get it done. Unfortunately, he's busy traipsing around the country raising money for his reelection. That is not leadership and is certainly not going to provide timely tax relief to the millions of taxpayers who need it. I yield the floor. I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
And as we wait for senators to come back to the floor here, a little look ahead what's going on today. A judicial nomination for the Western District of Tennessee. We expect debate to get underway on that in about 20 minutes, with a vote scheduled for noon Eastern in the Senate. The Senate recesses for their weekly party lunch meetings. That should be about 12:30. They'll come back about 2:15, and they'll resume debate on that payroll tax credit bill. By the way, the House today begins a debate at noon Eastern on a bill that would repeal the health care law. Our coverage of the House always on C-SPAN, and the Senate right here on C-SPAN 2.
From Vermont.
President, I'd ask consent the call of the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination, the judiciary, John Thomas Fowlkes, Jr. of Tennessee, to be United States District Judge for the Western District of Tennessee.
And Mr. President.
Under the previous order, there will be 30 minutes of debate, equally divided in the usual form, sir.
Mr. President, I see the distinguished senior senator from Tennessee on the floor, and I will make sure that he has plenty of time to speak. If not, I will ask consent for extra time for him. I am worried, however, and I say this knowing of the strong support of the senator from Tennessee for John Fowlkes, Jr. I am concerned that Senate Republicans are following through on their partisan opposition to the President by seeking to slam the door on qualified consensus judicial nominees who have bipartisan support. In doing so, they take advantage of the delaying tactics they've been deploying for 3.5 years. Now, it may seem like good political partisan sense to try to block President Obama at each step that way on judges, but it hurts the American people, all Americans, Republicans and Democrats. What the American people and the overburdened federal courts need are qualified judges who can administer justice. They're not helped by partisan games. When people go into a court, they don't care whether it's Democrats or Republicans. They just want the court to be there. Their taxes are paying for them. They want to have judges there. You know, we followed the most extended period of high vacancy rates, the most extended period of historically high vacancy rates in the history of our district courts. Nearly 1 in every 11 federal judgeships remains vacant because of the slowdown tactics of the Republicans here in the United States Senate. Now, that's more than twice the vacancy rate by this date during the first term of President Bush's term. Look at this, Mr. President. Taking the first 4 years of President Bush's term, and we started with very high vacancy rates in that because Republicans had blocked so many of President Clinton's nominees. When I came in for part of that time, I was chairman of the committee. I said, notwithstanding what they did to President Clinton, let's not do that because it hurts the American people, it hurts the federal courts. So I worked very hard to bring the vacancy rate down. And look how we brought it down. Way, way, way down. From well over 100 down to 28. You would think, having done that to help out a Republican president, we would have the same kind of help from the Republicans, but no. They have blocked and blocked and blocked President Obama's nominees. It's a stark contrast, this chart shows, to the way in which we moved to reduce judicial vacancies during the last Republican presidency. Now, the chart shows that the Senate can do better because it has done better. During President Bush's first term, we reduced the number of judicial vacancies by almost 75%. As I said when I became chairman, in the summer of 2001, there were 110 vacancies. As chairman, I worked with the Bush administration and senators from both sides of the aisle to confirm 100 judicial nominees of a conservative Republican president in 17 months. And then when we went back in the minority, we continued to work with the Senate Republicans. We confirmed President Bush's consensus judicial nominees well into 2004, which was, of course, a presidential election year. At the end of that presidential term, we had acted to confirm 205 circuit district court nominees. 100 of them during the 17 months I was chairman, another 105 during the 31 months the Republicans had the chairmanship. We reduced judicial vacancies to 29. By comparison, vacancies have long remained near or above 80, while little comparative progress is made during the 4 years of President Obama's first term. There are still 77 vacancies as of July 2012, more than 2.5 times the number of vacancies at this point in President Bush's first term. Each day, the Senate Republicans refuse, because of this political agenda blocking President Obama, when they refuse to confirm these qualified judicial nominees who have been reviewed and voted on, often unanimously by the Judiciary Committee. It's another day that a judge could have been working to administer justice. Hard-working and hard-pressed Americans shouldn't have to wait years to have their cases decided. I know in my state of Vermont, we expect to be able to come into a court and have our cases heard, not be asked whether it was a Republican or a Democratic president when that judge was appointed, but know the courts are sitting. Just as it is with the economy, with jobs, the American people do not want to hear excuses about why Republicans in Congress will not help them to reduce these vacancies. And they do not want to hear that the supposed justification is partisan, especially when dealing with a nonpartisan judiciary. Those arguments are precisely why Congress's approval rating among the American people is so low. The nonpartisan Congressional Research Service, in its recent report, confirms what I've said. And I prepared this chart, which is taken from CRS report. It shows the amount of time the circuit court nominees face. The amount of time they faced when President Reagan was president, when George H.W. Bush was president, when Bill Clinton was president, when George W. Bush was president. And then look what it is. What is so different about this president that his judicial nominees are treated so differently than all the presidents before him, Republicans and Democrats alike? It shows the median time circuit court nominees have had to wait before a Senate vote has skyrocketed from 18 days for President Bush's circuit nominees to 132 days for President Obama's. Those interested in Tennessee nominee today will remember how hard we had to work for almost 10 months, even though we had the strong support of Senator Alexander and Senator Corker, to get Senate Republicans to allow consideration of the nomination of Judge Jane Straunch of the Sixth Circuit. Republican senators try to take credit for the Senate having reached what they regard as their quota for circuit nominations this year, that they should remember the Senate would not even have had an up or down vote on 3 of the 5 of them without the majority leader first having to file for cloture to overcome Republican blocs. The Senate has yet to vote a single circuit court nominee nominated by President Obama this year. Since 1980, the only presidential election year in which no circuit nominee who was nominated that year and confirmed that year was in 1996. Senate Republicans did the same thing. They shut down the process against President Clinton's circuit nominees. Now, the fact that Republican stalling tactics that meant the circuit court nominees that should have been confirmed in the spring are still waiting a vote after the 4th of July is no excuse for not moving forward this month to confirm the circuit nominees who were voted out of the Judiciary Committee with bipartisan support. American people are waiting for justice. Do not care about excuses. They don't care about some false sense of settling political scores. They want justice, just as they want action on measures the President has suggested to help the economy and create jobs, rather than political calculations about who will be helped the most, a Republican or a Democrat candidate in the elections in November. Mr. President, the courts are supposed to be nonpartisan. People expect nonpartisan justice. And what is happening by these unprecedented stalling tactics is making the whole federal judiciary system partisan. I hope that Senate Republicans will reconsider their ill-conceived partisan strategy, work with us to meet the needs of the American people. There's no reason the Senate can't vote to confirm the other 15 well-qualified judicial nominees reported by the committee, some of the best I've seen in my 37 years in the Senate. There's no reason why we can't work together to help solve the problem, high judicial vacancies, and better serve the American public. Democrats proved they could do that with George W. Bush, as the earlier chart showed. I wish Republicans would return the same favor to a Democratic president. I see I put my closed statement on the record. I ask consent.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I see the two distinguished senators from Tennessee on the floor, and I yield the floor, reserving the balance of my time.
Mr. President.
Senior Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I thank the distinguished chairman of the Judiciary Committee for his courtesy in allowing Senator Corker and me a chance to speak about Judge Folks from Tennessee. I don't intend to get into a lengthy dispute with the senator from Vermont about the relative merits of the two political parties in approving judges, but I do have to admire his persistence and creativity in always coming up with a way and how Democrats approve more Republican judges than Republicans approve Democratic judges. I noticed that our ranking member, Senator Grassley, will put a statement in the record today making a clear statement about what the record is. But if I may just borrow from that, today's vote will be the 156th nominee of President Obama confirmed to district and circuit judges. We've also confirmed 2 Supreme Court nominees during President Obama's term. The last time the Senate confirmed 2 Supreme Court nominees was during President Bush's second term. During President Bush's entire second term, the Senate confirmed a total of only 119 district and circuit court nominees. With Judge Folks' confirmation today, we'll have confirmed 33 more district and circuit nominees for President Obama than we did for President Bush in similar circumstances. That's according to Senator Grassley's comments, which will be inserted into the record. And I would have to say to my friend from Vermont, my memory is good enough that about this time 4 years ago, when we had a Republican president, I think I remember the Majority Leader of the Senate, Senator Reid, and Senator Leahy both suggesting that it was time that we slowed things down and not confirm any more circuit judges until we saw how the election came out in November. So we're basically, in our opinion, applying in the fairest possible way to the Senate the Thurman-Leahy rule that has been developed over time. If there are excellent nominees by the President to the circuit courts, well, the election's only 4 months away, and if he's reelected, they can be confirmed in November and December. And if he's not, then his successor will have a chance to make those nominations. Let me speak today about a matter that I believe we have great agreement on in the Senate among the President, and that is the nomination by the President of Judge John Folks to fill a vacancy on the United States District Court for the Western District of Tennessee. As the Governor of Tennessee, I had the responsibility of appointing about maybe 50 judges over 8 years. I looked for good intelligence, good temperament, good understanding of the law, respect for those who came before the court. I didn't feel it was my responsibility ever to inquire how a judge might decide on a particular case before he took the position. So I took some time to look into Judge Folks' background when President Obama nominated him. I was delighted with what I found, and I'm pleased to recommend him to our colleagues. His performance has been praised throughout his career in the community of Memphis and Shelby County, where he's best known. His leadership, his citizenship, his high professionalism, his courtesy to others are the words I often hear. I have letters from Bar Association members who say he has a creative and independent mind. From others in Memphis who say he is passionate about the community in which he lives, appearing at civic events repeatedly, committing over 50 hours of service annually to the Memphis area legal services, active in support of the Boy Scouts. So, Mr. President, it is with great pleasure that I recommend to our colleagues today President Obama's nominee of Judge John Folks to fill a vacancy on the United States District Court for the Western District of Tennessee.
Mr. President.
Junior Senator from Tennessee.
I rise to second what the great Senator from Tennessee, Lamar Alexander, has just said. I want to speak for a moment about the same nomination with the same amount of energy and the fact that I'm very excited about this person being nominated. When the White House began looking for someone to fill this position, I talked to numbers of people down in Shelby County about Judge Folks, and people that I respected, people that have been involved in the community for years, and I can just tell you from every single person that I talked to, they talked not only about his record, but also the kind of person that he was. He has served in many, many positions. He's been a public defender, a district attorney, a U.S. attorney. He was the chief administrative officer for the largest and most populous county in the state of Tennessee, and now he serves as a criminal court judge. At every stop, he's excelled and earned a reputation for professionalism and integrity, and I think his experience certainly makes him very well prepared for this position and the responsibilities that he will carry out. So I'm glad to join with Senator Alexander, with Senator Leahy and others. I hope we have an overwhelming vote today for this gentleman who I believe is going to be an outstanding federal judge, and I want to ask all of my colleagues to join us in supporting this person who, again, I think will be exemplary on the bench as he has been throughout his entire life. With that, I yield the floor, and I notice the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President,
We're in a quorum.
I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask for the yeas and nays of the nominee.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The yeas and nays have been ordered.
Mr. President, I suggest the absence of
Clerk
quorum.
will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
objection? The question is on the nomination. The ayes and nays have been ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bingaman, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, Mr. Brown of Ohio, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Conrad, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Dement, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heller, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hutchison, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Inouye, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Cole, Mr. Kyle, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Lautenberg, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Lieberman, Mr. Lugar, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson of Nebraska, Mr. Nelson of Florida, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Snow, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Bingaman, Brown of Massachusetts, Cardin, Corker, Grassley, Isaacson, Carey, Kyle, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, and Vitter. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Conrad, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye. Mrs. Hagan. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lieberman, aye. Mr. Webb. Mr. Webb, aye. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn? Aye. Mr. Bennett? Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mr. Lugar? Mr. Lugar? Aye. Mr. Dement? No. Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson of Florida? Aye. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen? Aye. Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. Mr. Coons? Mr. Coons? Aye. Mr. Wyden? Mr. Wyden? Aye. Mr. Barrasso? Mr. Barrasso? Aye. Mr. Cochran? Mr. Cochran? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin? Aye. Mr. Heller? Mr. Heller? Aye. Mr. Paul? Mr. Paul? Aye. Mr. Nelson? Mr. Nelson of Nebraska? Aye. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Thune? Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Aye. Mr. Rockefeller? Mr. Rockefeller? Aye. Mr. Roberts? Mr. Roberts? Aye. Mr. Coates? Mr. Coates? Aye. Ms. Collins? Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Harkin? Mr. Harkin? Aye. Ms. Cantwell? Ms. Cantwell? Aye.
Good morning. Robert, you're still there. How about you, Ralph? Oh, no, you
Ms. Ayotte? Ms. Ayotte? Aye. Mr. Carper? Mr. Carper? Aye. Mr. Franken? Mr. Franken? Aye. Mr. Inouye? Mr. Inouye, aye. Mr. Brown? Mr. Brown of Ohio? Aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? Aye. Mr. Johans? Mr. Johans? Aye. Mr. Pryor? Mr. Pryor? Aye. Mr. Casey? Mr. Casey? Aye. Ms. Snow? Ms. Snow? Aye. Mr. Akaka? Mr. Akaka? Aye. Mr. Risch? Mr. Risch? Aye. Ms. Stabenow? Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Hatch? Aye. Mr. Wicker? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? Mr. Whitehouse? Aye. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mrs. Hutchison. Mrs. Hutchison, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Enzi. Aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Toomey, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Rubio, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Lautenberg, aye.
Texas, Utah, nice to meet you. Virginia.
Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal? Mr. Blumenthal? Aye. Mr. Baucus? Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye.
That was a short parade.
Yeah. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby. Aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski. Aye.
Has every member voted? Does any member wish to change his or her vote? On this vote, the yeas are 94, the nays are 2, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session. Under the previous order, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.
Senator